Today, we're going to take a look at the African slave trade. We're going to take a look at first where slavery comes from in Africa, and then we're also going to look at how Europeans changed basically the very definition of slavery. So first, the slave trade. When we talk about the slave trade, there's really two parts to it. The first part is the one that most people at least know something about, and that is the transportation of slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, whether the New World is Brazil or Barbados or Charleston, South Carolina. These slaves are bound for some kind of New World port. But then there's the other part that people know less about, and that is how Africans are obtained, kidnapped, and sold in Africa itself. And we'll talk extensively about that. This illustration here is actually that of a slave market in Charleston in 1856. This should be not just doubly ominous, but triply ominous, because Charleston is ground zero of secession during the year 1860, late 1860. So slavery and the slave trade is not just important for world history, but if we're being selfish as Americans, think about the fact that slavery directly causes the bloodiest war in U.S. history, and it's the bloodiest by a long shot, and that is, of course, the American Civil War. Almost twice as bloody as the entirety of the Second World War was for the United States. So these changes that you see in response to the colonization of the New World have some incalculably powerful ripple effects. So first, the emergence of slavery within Africa. And we got to zoom out and sort of take the view from 40,000 feet in the air to get the full context, because slavery existed in Africa before the first Europeans. Slavery has existed in almost every society in one way, shape, or form. Human beings kind of suck. Maybe Hobbes was sort of right there. We're always, or at least some of our species is always looking out for ways to essentially coerce, bully, or exploit other members of the species. So slavery is mentioned in sources as varied as the Bible. It's mentioned in the Quran. It's mentioned in most of the world's religions. It's mentioned in probably most of the world's legal systems up to this point. But remember that even though slavery is remarkably common, chattel slavery based upon race is something that's new. It's something that really develops in the 15 and 1600s, and later on takes off on an industrial scale in the 16 and 1700s. So if we look at the slave trade in Africa, you see that there are trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and East African trade routes that have been trading in slaves for centuries. Most of the slaves were women, and most are traded as concubines for harems, and also to be used as domestic servants. So in other words, these aren't slaves that are going out and cultivating things like sugarcane or cotton or these other cash crops. So you also have some males that are also sent. Sometimes these could be soldiers. And by the way, the use of slave soldiers is also something that is surprisingly common throughout the ancient world. They're used as field workers. This is like for things like salt production and gold mines, and also as caravan laborers. So slavery exists internally within Africa as well as externally beyond Africa. And that's something that's kind of important to remember. So something to kind of think about when we're looking at the impact of Europeans in either the New World or Africa is that the Europeans very rarely invent one of the maladies or one of the social ills that we're going to look at today. They don't invent slavery. They don't invent something like warfare. But what they do is they take it to an extreme degree. And let's kind of talk about, for example, warfare. We talked about the fact that the Native Americans were not pacifist by any stretch of the imagination. Anybody who says that, just laugh in their face and say Aztecs. You have an entire society that is mobilized for war and around the capturing of human captives to be used as sacrifices. So Native Americans were not pacifistic, but at the same time, it was rare that they fought wars to completely exterminate or destroy the other society. Whereas Europeans could sometimes do that, especially in the New World, where they would just fight until one tribe or the other had been completely destroyed. Even the somewhat pacifistic Puritans do that, fighting against the Wampanoag tribe in 1636. No, I think it's like 1654. Anyway, I'll look at the dates later. But anyway, even the Puritans could fight wars of existence, whereas Native Americans, even the Aztecs to a certain extent, practiced more limited war. So the same dynamic kind of exists for slavery. They don't invent slavery. What they do is they modify it into chattel slavery, and they increase it to a near industrial scale. So at first, Europeans, and we're really just talking about the Portuguese here for the most part, they began participating in the slave trade by using the pre-existing routes that had already existed in Africa to supply their slaves. And so this has been used, well, it's used then as well as ever since as a way to justify enslavement of Africans in the New World. And by about the mid-1400s, you begin to see Europeans enslaving people to be used as household servants. It's sort of like a display of wealth and luxury for, well-to-do European families. So we had talked before about how Portugal was both an early adopter of colonialism and also an early adopter of the slave trade. And one of the reasons for that is because Portugal acquires the sugar-producing islands of the Azores and also the island of Madeira. And remember, the original population of those islands was wiped out because of diseases and exploitation, and so the Portuguese bring in black slaves from West Africa to basically make up the difference. It's also around this time period that the first slaves are brought to Portugal from Africa, and those, air quotes, successes prompts further participation in the slave trade by Portugal. At this point, you begin to see the emergence of factories, not the same as our factories of the Industrial Revolution. It's what the Portuguese basically call their slave trading posts that dot all along the West African coast, especially in areas like Elmina and Luanda. So with these trading posts, there's a trade in Asian luxury goods and European manufactured items for gold, spices, pepper, and slaves. Now, at first, the Portuguese did sort of come in and raid large sections of West Africa. But the Portuguese, both because of their small numbers and because they feared going into the uncharted African interior, they found that it was much more convenient to work with local African rulers and negotiate with them directly for slaves. What the Portuguese also quickly realized is that many of these African kingdoms were fairly well organized and fairly powerful. Kingdoms like Congo, Benin, Mali, the Songhay. The Portuguese were a little dicey about how successful they would be in a direct military confrontation with those states fighting on their home turf. So again, they decided to basically maintain positive relationships with these African kingdoms. Now, the European desire for slaves really kicks off once the Native American population that was presumed to be an exploitable working class basically gets wiped out. Again, I've repeated this statistic again, but within the first 100 years of the Columbian Exchange, about 90% of the Native American population in both North and South America is just totally wiped out. So in 1502, just 10 years after Columbus discovers the New World, the first African slaves are brought to the Americas. Now, even though Africa had a number of goods that the Europeans were interested in, lions, animal skins, etc., by around the 1600s, by 1600 exactly, the slave trade had basically predominated almost all other kinds of commerce on the African coast. And that creates a lot of rivalry and a lot of competition within Europe itself. So at first, the Portuguese have basically a monopoly on the slave trade. We call this the asiento, Asiento. But eventually, the Dutch start sort of moving in on Portuguese territory, and in 1637, the Dutch seize the factory of Elmina. Um, so by around the 17th century, the Dutch, the English, the French, are all competing with the Portuguese for more and more slaves. So, who are the individuals who were enslaved? Most of the individuals in Africa who were enslaved were either prisoners of war, criminals, or exiled individuals. And again, I'm going to stress that for the most part, these individuals are working as domestic servants, soldiers, miners. They're not involved with cash crop cultivation, which is a very different kind of labor. Um, the Europeans, for the most part, are trading with Africans directly, as well as their leaders, to acquire slaves, as opposed to engaging in slave raids. It sometimes happened, but the reason that the Europeans shy away from slave raids is not because they suddenly become, more humanitarian. It's because slave raids were incredibly inefficient. They were time consuming. There was always the possibility that the Africans could fight back and do a very, very good job of it. So working directly with local governments was seen as being the best and most efficient use of time and resources. So very often, African rulers and traders would trade slaves for European manufactured goods, especially guns. So once Europeans traded for Africans, slaves were forced to march all the way down to trading towns and ports, and there they were often separated from their families. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but just on that journey itself, something like a quarter to 1/3 of the population died just from that journey. There's this sort of slow but steady shift in the slave market in Africa. It starts with this area called Senegambia. Then it goes to Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, and it gradually proceeds sort of in an easterly direction, presumably because, this area is obviously going to be closer for Europeans, but slowly but surely probably some of the economic opportunities start drying off, and it's seen to be cheaper to trade further east and further south. Eventually, the West Central Africa region becomes the primary ground for kidnapping and transporting slaves. Once slaves arrived at the port, they were quickly loaded onto slave ships and transported to the New World. And that was a journey that could take anywhere from 2 to 4 months, depending upon the currents, depending upon the final destination, that kind of thing. So this gives you a diagram of just how densely packed those slave ships could be. There was so little room that oftentimes slaves couldn't even sit upright during the journey. And the conditions on these slave ships were absolutely excruciating. So oftentimes slaves were left to basically defecate, in other words, like poop, where they were sitting for the entire journey. So you can obviously imagine just how horrible the disease would be. And very often by the end of one of these journeys, up to 50% of the slave population on one of these ships would die. So you've already lost roughly a quarter to 1/3 just on the journey to one of the ports. Now you've lost an additional like 50% just because of the transatlantic voyage. All of these dynamics were pretty standard in what we call the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is the actual journey of slaves upon slave ships from Africa to the Americas. And these ships were packed as tightly as they could be to maximize traders' profits. So you already kind of see that shift that we've talked about from Old World slavery to New World slavery. Old World slavery, slaves could be exploited and brutalized, but there was still this sense that they were human beings. With chattel slavery, the idea is a slave is an object, and you see how that makes an impact in really significant ways, like this, where they're literally sometimes packed on top of each other, and also in minor ways that we'll probably talk about a little bit later. Um, it says mortality is high, 15 to 20%. I've heard even higher numbers. I've heard up to 50% mortality. It kind of depends upon how densely packed the ship was, living conditions, etc. You could get cargoes as high as 800 slaves on one ship. If supplies ran low, oftentimes the weakest slaves were thrown overboard. Also, once slaves reached port towns, they were almost immediately separated from families. And also on slave ships themselves, you had the men basically sequestered in one area, the women in another, the children in a third section. And here's one of the things that slave owners eventually found out. So if, and I think that this is like one of the most heartbreaking things about slavery, actually. One of the things you're going to find out, hopefully, is that parents generally like their kids. I hope you experience that. But yeah, parents generally like their kids and they want the best for their kids, even if that is at their own expense. So, the issue with that from the perspective of slave owners is that slaves might risk more direct, more violent action if they're doing it to protect a spouse or children or somebody who's just really important to them. So the idea is you break up as many bonds of loyalty as you can find, so that way the only source of loyalty they have is to the slave owner. And even when you see the emergence of families, of slave families in the New World, oftentimes the kids were immediately separated from the parents. And so for many slaves in the New World, their quote unquote parents might actually be like aunts and uncles, or maybe grandparents, or maybe even complete strangers. There was that need to create these sort of chosen families by necessity because of how slave owners intentionally broke up almost any and all family dynamics. We frankly don't have very many sources about the slave trade or the Middle Passage from the perspective of West Africans themselves, partially because just so darn many died either on the voyage over, or they quickly thereafter died once they actually got to the New World, wherever their destination was intended to be. Slave mortality was always very, very high in most parts of the New World. The other reason is that in order to have an account, you basically need to read or write. Hopefully both, right? Now, something that complicates that is in most colonies, there were actual felonies for teaching slaves to read and write. And many of those felonies continue to exist in state legal codes during the Civil War, and in some cases afterwards as well. So, for example, when Southern state governments in the 1870s and 1880s start trying to pass laws that demand that voters know how to read and write in order to vote, It's no surprise that very few African Americans know how to read and write because just 10, 15 years ago, Southern state governments were actually putting people in prison for just teaching black slaves how to read and write. One exception to this is Olaudah Equiano, who was born in 1745 east of the Niger Delta. So, kidnapped at age 11, traded as a slave, brought to Barbados, which basically is like the worst place you could go in English colonial America. But from Barbados, he eventually gets bought and sent to Virginia, and then he purchases his freedom in 1766 and eventually travels to London. He becomes an outspoken abolitionist, and it's one of the first instances we can actually use that word. Just right quick, this is going to help you for this course. It's also going to help you for U.S. history next year. So being an abolitionist and being against slavery are very, very different things. Abraham Lincoln was against slavery. Totally. Hated the institution. He wasn't an abolitionist, though, at least not when he runs for office. An abolitionist is someone who believes that slavery is wrong, not because it's gross, not because it's not compatible with ideas of the Enlightenment. It's the idea that slavery is wrong because slavery is evil. And I would also add in the idea that slavery is a sin against God. And so because slavery is evil, you can't compromise with it. We don't see very many abolitionists in the 1700s, but they are beginning to emerge. And that's going to be pretty significant for the history of both the United States and later on Brazil. But his account of the slave trade is well, really, it's only for those with an iron stomach because it's about as bad as you would expect and worse, describing conditions especially on the slave ships. But because this is one of the first accounts that we get, it does make a pretty significant impact. The slave trade basically exists from the early 1500s until the British Royal Navy declares war on it in the early 1800s. So it exists for about 300 years. And that means that it causes probably the largest forced population transfer in the history of the world. It transports nearly 10 million people from one continent to another. Some historians have said that if those population figures are true, then that means it's the largest forced migration in the history of the world. Now, Americans are very famous, or maybe infamous, for thinking that Africa is just a country and not an entire continent, which it most undoubtedly is. But if you look at where slaves are being kidnapped from, this is a very diverse region of Africa. I know that there are very few areas on planet Earth where the population is not diverse, but for example, in Nigeria, if you, let's say, get a slave from the northern Hausa Fulani areas, they're going to be very different from the mostly Christian Igbo population to the south. So you get all of these different people from different African traditions and in some cases very different languages, and you bring them all to the New World, and the result is that suddenly all of those differences they have with one another don't seem as dramatic as the differences they have between, let's say, Europeans or Native Americans that they encounter. So what you get is you kind of have the emergence of this African culture in America that sort of de-emphasizes traditional differences that people have within Africa and just emphasize the unique African elements that they have in common. Now, if you notice, the vast majority of the slave population is being sent to Brazil. And in second place, basically the remainder is sent to the West Indies to cultivate sugar. there's like a tiny amount that's being sent to the United States. And some people might kind of find that to be ironic because obviously slavery has a huge outsized role in U.S. history. We'll talk about that more specifically later on, but this just kind of gives you an idea of where the slave trade stands by the 17th and 18th centuries. And I'll also say this. For the most part, slavery was so bad that it becomes a self-correcting problem. In large areas of the West Indies, in places like Brazil, the conditions of slavery were so horrible that slave masters had to endure almost constant revolts, constant anarchy, and eventually, you might even say, this is an example of karma, slave masters became terrified and paranoid of their slaves. An example I like to use to illustrate that is in South Carolina. It was against the law not to bring your gun to church on Sunday. Reason being is that if there was going to be a slave rebellion, it was thought that it was going to happen on a Sunday where everybody would be at church. So, in an effort to prevent a slave rebellion from happening, there was a law that required all South Carolinian males to bring a gun to church. That is how paranoid these slave-owning societies could get. And as a consequence, as you might imagine, they end up unraveling from the inside. And we'll talk about that soon. Till next time.